Okay, so finally we're going to insurance. So we have a very interesting project together with Fathom and with AXA. AXA is our clients, but in fact I really see it as a collaboration between the three parties, because all three parties do a little bit of the work basically, or well, significant parts of the work, but we jointly try to establish a really transparent European scale flood catastrophe model. And so, yeah, also this presentation, obviously, it's really devised by a team. So I've presented here a team, and my name is in green, but all the others have contributed just as much or even more than myself. So transparency in this project is key, and where you may be used to CAD modelers that typically they have as a product, and they have as output that little thing here down below, event catalogs. And that's, yeah, if you ask for something like that as a client, then that's what you get. Some of the issues recognized also, and not only by insurers, but also by the regulators, is that, well, how is that actually established? And where are the uncertainties in such a catalog? Where do they arise from? Where can we possibly improve our understanding of risk? And that's basically sort of what we're trying to establish, that not only that event catalog, but also all the intermediate steps become more transparent, if you like, and also the results of that. Where does the uncertainty of this event catalog, where does it actually come from, and which step is that established, so that you also have an understanding of how meaningful the results are, as well as where you could potentially improve those. And we have ongoing discussions like how much of this workflow can we actually open up for researchers or for further development or for others to use. That's still under discussion. So essentially the rest, it's really quite a standard, I would almost say, for how to establish such an event catalog. Come up with a very long series of events, and then you sample from those events what those impacts are on your portfolio. And we use a combination of stochastic weather generation on the top, which AXA leads itself, distributed hydrological models, which is done by Deltaris with our WFlow model instrument, and then high resolution hydraulic model simulations set to sample events from and stitch them together into events, and spatially distinct events. And so in this presentation, we really focus on the hazard part, because traditionally the impact part is very difficult to say something about, because the portfolio information of AXA is obviously sensitive information which you cannot share in presentations like this. So modeling philosophy on the left side of the slide, we come up with an event-based approach that accounts for spatial correlations. That is really important for insurance, because the spatial correlation of events determines also what the impacts really are on your portfolio. And then events are generated through SWG, as a stochastic weather generation, which is routed through a hydrological model. And we use then the outputs, and that's quite an important thing, the outputs of the hydrological model in terms of their probability of occurrence. So we don't actually use the flows coming out. So you would think, okay, there's a flow coming out of that model, and then we propagate that into a hydraulic simulation. But in fact, that's not what we do. So Fathom already creates, based on statistics of observations of gauge records, what those flood maps are with certain probabilities. And it is up to us as Deltaris to produce what kind of flows can you expect, and what is then the associated probability of that flows, so that you can look up which probability, which map to sample from the Fathom hydraulic simulations. So we convert all the river flows into probabilities, essentially. So what does that look like? So stochastic modeling of weather at this scale, European scale, is actually quite challenging. What we do at this moment, and I'm not convinced that this is the perfect approach yet, but currently what we do is we resample already existing records, daily records from the Era 5 archive. The only thing we change is the order, and we basically use patterns in the weather, both spatially and temporally, to decide which should be the following day. And we have some stochastics in there to, of course, vary that. And therefore, you will never create new daily events, simply because you're sampling from history, but you do create, that is the idea, new multi-day events. And therefore, you're also able to generate new forcings for riverine flooding, for instance. Of course, really important, and this is a bit where the transparency comes in, how does that then perform? So what is then the 2 daily precipitation? Does that concur a little bit if you do a 10,000 year stochastic weather generation and you compare the statistics like the 20-year return period on the top and the 40-year return period, rainfall, 2-day rainfall, observations against simulations, the left is observations, right is simulations, does that then compare fairly well? And in fact, it's difficult to see here, but as you go to higher return, higher amounts, so 5 daily and 10 daily, and you do see some differences appearing. So you see a little bit that here and there, if you look compare this graph with that graph, there are some underestimations of the 10 daily event. So there is something to improve, in particular in the alpine regions, and there are things to improve. We know that then. Yeah, and how does that then propagate into, if you for instance look at a catchment like the Rhine, and we can in fact see that especially the high return periods, 10 daily rainfall amounts, which you see here on the right side. So you see that those red crosses, which are the observed extremes, they are a little bit higher in fact than what our stochastic model says. And so we can evaluate that and think, okay, what does that mean for our risk estimates? And that's also up to us now to do that, of course. But we also know that there's potentially something to improve. And so we currently have a student that also focuses on reshuffling in space. What if you move weather patterns around and allow that as an additional stochastic process? And that could be a potential for improvement of these things. Now, something else we did, yeah, that is the next step, is the hydrology. So we now have for these different colors represent different model domains. And so we have a model domain roughly for Spain, for the UK and Ireland, France, and all these dots are gauge records. And so we have used a lot of gauge records, collated them to evaluate also how good these models perform. We did some calibration of hydrological models. Typically is a local problem, and you have a local gauge. We try to optimize the parameters to as much as possible represent the flows at that local gauge or several local gauges. Now here we had the problem that we wanted to do this across the entire Europe domain, and we did not want to come up with a specific parameter set for one specific gauge and its upstream area, but rather we wanted to have a parameter set that worked fairly well across Europe. That was a little bit our challenge. So we didn't calibrate using specific gauge records and then calibrate the hell out of them, but we basically used Pedo transfer functions to relate parameters to physical parameters like soil types, elevation derivatives, etc. And then try to come up with Pedo transfer functions that reasonably well resonate what these gauges tell us the river flows do. Yeah, and then again, we have to be really transparent about this. This does not work as well everywhere. So for instance, here we have a gauge where you see that the observed discharge is actually it's a lot lower than the simulated discharge. So we're overestimating flows. But what we did is also emphasize on what we actually want to extract from the model, and that is this given flow at a certain moment in our very long records. What probability of occurrence does that flow have with respect to the rest of all the flows you have seen in the 10,000 year records? And that's what you see here happening on this graph, where we extract extreme events from the 10,000 years and compare that with the extreme events observed in the same series in terms of their probability of occurrence. And then actually, it's actually pretty well performance. So, and we did that for all the gauges that we had. And then you see this pattern arising, where green basically means that these return periods are quite well resonating the return periods shown in the observed. But you also see a number of interesting yellow points where it doesn't work that well, or even red points where it performs really poorly. So at this moment, it's up to us to figure out why do we see these yellows over there, and why do we see some reds here in Spain? That could be related to the fact that in Spain, I expect actually that reservoir operations play a large role. We do not have specific things there, but it does mean that if we want to improve the results, we know what to look for. Say for instance, in estuaries, often we see that water splits. Yeah, the splits between going left or right, that could also be underrepresented in our model. So we know where to improve. Again, we want to be really transparent about that. Now, what can you then extract from these kinds of simulations? Well, this is an example for the 2002 summer events over Central Europe that many of you will know about still. And yeah, if you would only use 42 records and use the hydrological model to simulate what is the return period of this event, and use you have to use a Gumbel fit to somehow come up with more or less what the extreme event is, then you get very peculiar results. You see that there's a lot of reds, meaning that the return period is above 1,000-year return period. Now, if you use a lot of sampled events and then compare that against our empirical record, so basically we have 10,000 years, which we can basically look up where does this event sit within that 10,000-year series, you get a very different picture. So you see that the return period is, especially in the Elbe, looks to be severely overestimated if you would only use a very short series. So just an example to show how these results can be used in interrogators. And this is then the factor difference in return periods that you see. It's actually the same result. Now, I heard a lot also about the event EVA yesterday. So I did a little bit of work to also see how EVA is doing. We also see a quite different picture. So it was a 1 to 200-year event. And if I look at our 42-year records, it's actually quite close, it seems. But actually, it seems from our results that the return period of that event in this area is actually a little bit lower than that. I don't want to say that this is this we can think about it and scrutinize it and discuss it, of course, but at least we can get insights in what's multiple events, more events mean, and we can now also go back to how well does the weather generator actually perform in this area, and how well does the hydrological model perform to see how much trust we have in this right figure. Yeah, and new events. So we can actually start to interrogate, okay, for instance, in Spain, where do we find the events with the highest true real return periods? And then you see new events appearing that never occurred in the past, but that could have a meaning for the portfolio of AXA. And the same with events with the most involved locations, for instance. Yeah, the next step obviously is the hydraulic simulations. And we've seen a lot about Fedden models. So this is a nice video to just show how great it is. So I'm not going into that. You can ask all about it. But basically, we look up for subcatchments of a specified size. What is the return period of a certain event according to the hydrology, and look up which flood map should be fit into that subcatchment given that return period. And that we do for loads of events. There could be millions of events across Europe by which we can do that. And that eventually then leads to us being able to compute things like impacts with a certain return period, which is important for insurance. And also this is validated. We look up, does this method actually work? If we look up an event in our historical simulation, we look at what the river flow is in that graph. We look up that river flow, what probability does that have? If we then look up the map with that probability in Fedden's map, does that then concur with the actual observations that we have from satellite observations, for instance? And that was done over quite a number of regions, and roughly green basically means that yes, there is a quite good concurrence with satellites, and red means that the model is overestimating inundation, and blue that it's underestimating. And then the next step is, I think these are sort of the technical next steps. We have done the left side, but going towards event set generation, loss modeling, and the financial engine of AXA, that is currently sort of in the works. But I think also a next step is, how do we improve this? We know now what all these pieces are worth. How do we go to that next step? And hopefully AXA is willing then also to open up some of the components of this framework. Well, I can at least say that the W-flow models that we use, the hydrological models that Deltares established, they will become available for further use. So I think with that, I'd like to thank you for your patience, and I hope I haven't.
Nobody felt hungry because it was such a great talk. So very good. I would suggest we have one question, and then you can have the further questions with Professor and during lunch. So good old time. Go ahead. So please, thanks a lot. actually interesting. I would have, many more questions to you on the treatment, but okay. One of the things, so the cookie capping of the Hessel, sometimes it can be like the only affordable way of running some problems. But it presents a lot of challenges. One that I find particularly challenging, I would like to hear how you solve it or how you went about it. Is, when you have, tributaries, assigning, for example, the contribution of main river or tributary, the bloody part, it's mixed sometimes, like in a hazard, part of one, for example. So how do you distinguish those things? How do you manage, these complexes?
Yeah. Nightmare, yeah. Well, it's not a nightmare. I think it's quite interesting, actually. But it's a complicated problem. We don't really do a lot with that at the moment, and I agree with you that there could be locations where it's relevant. In particular, locations where, first of all, the correlation between flows, high flows between those tributaries is relatively low, then it could matter. And locations where both have to be the case, and there are locations where the topography also dictates that it's quite flat, and water can actually, from one tributary, can cause backwater in the other tributary. So I think what could be interesting for the future avenues, and the computational problem was also addressed by Ollie yesterday in the compound event set, which basically you could say this is actually a compound event, especially if the correlations are low. Is that you try to identify those locations and where does it really matter, and pay more attention to those interactions by not making only one simulation with flows from both tributaries just added up, but rather make an array of computations with flows from those different tributaries over a number of ranges. And I'd rather than say you do a number of ranges over the amount of flow, and then figure out from the response surface which return period belongs to which combination, and then use that to draw it from basically from two, and not one variable, but from two variables which flood map to cookie cut, if you like. I think that could be a way forward, but then identify where is it really necessary, because the computational burden of going from a one-dimensional problem to a two-dimensional problem is significant. So I do recognize that from your remarks yesterday. So I don't think it's impossible. I think it could be a burden, but it's doable. I think if you find out first where it matters, where the correlations are low, and the correlations between the extreme low and where it's topographically important, then you can do something with that. Now.